Hello everyone, how's it going? It is Tyrnor as always, and the new World of Warcraft Chronicle book is out, and as always I'm going to do a video on it. Usually this would be the highlight of the year from a lore perspective, but this time I'm a bit more hesitant to say that, I suppose I should say, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. The structure of this video will be, as always, firstly I'll give a little bit on my general impressions on the book, which would be spoiler free. I guess if you can call this sort of book as containing spoilers, but regardless it'll be spoiler free, so to say. And then I'm going to talk about the new bits of lore and my opinions about said new bits of lore. So, starting off, is there any new lore in the chronicle, in this particular chronicle? Well, this volume of the World of Warcraft Chronicle covers the events of Warcraft 3 and World of Warcraft up to and including Cataclysm, and the events in between, and the events between Beyond the Dark Portal and Warcraft 3. And there aren't really, to be perfectly honest, any major new pieces of lore. The lore portrayed in this new Chronicle book is basically, the new lore I mean, is basically reinterpretations of events or portraying certain events from a different light, maybe providing a different perspective. And there are one or two moments which are, actual new lore events, but I don't think they are major enough to warrant an entire book, so to say. So now, beforehand I praised Chronicle 2 for sort of tying all of the events that it covered into a coherent history, but this praise is a bit less applicable now. Chronicle 2 made all of these events coherent history by adding to them significantly and tying them together. Chronicle 3 turns the events of World of Warcraft and Warcraft 3 and such into a coherent story by retconning it here and there and synthesizing it to the point of leaving out certain, perhaps important stuff. Which raises again the question, and I actually had this question in the comments on the Chronicle 2 video. Chronicle 2 basically skimmed over a lot of the details of Beyond the Dark Portal, which were present in the Beyond the Dark Portal novel, but not in Chronicle 2. And someone asked, well, if they're not in Chronicle 2 anymore, are they not canon anymore? And I said basically, well, no, Chronicle, because it is limited in terms of how much stuff they can actually put in the book, they don't actually have the space to detail all of that stuff. So I said it's not necessarily a retcon, it's just they didn't have the time to properly detail everything. But now with Chronicle 3, the question is all the more relevant because Chronicle 3 basically tries to sum up all of the events of, like I said, Warcraft 3, World of Warcraft and its expansions up to Cataclysm and everything in between, and it skims over a lot of stuff, some would argue even relevant stuff, and some of said stuff could have been added in with, say, just a sentence or two, but it's not. So the question arises, is omitting something considered a retcon? And I'm not entirely sure how to answer that. I obviously hope not, because the bits that are retconned for the most part are bits I actually like from the lore. But well, I think one of the main criticisms of Chronicle 3, which made me realize something about Chronicle as a series as a whole, is that Chronicle 3 is more of a, so to say, a standalone book. Everything is portrayed in a narrative manner instead of it being sort of a history book of Warcraft. Now what I mean by that is Chronicle 3 starts with, long time ago there was Sargeras and the Pantheon and such, and this is info we already knew. This is info that was already explained in far greater detail in Chronicles 1 and 2, but Chronicle 3 brings it up anyway, so the reader is not sort of confused when Sargeras's name pops up later on. So it, like I said, it's basically constructed to be a standalone book for people who don't necessarily know much about the lore, which kind of betrays the purpose, I think, of what Chronicle was supposed to be, which was a synthesized version, a sort of final version of the Warcraft universe, free of all retcons. Although that's not entirely accurate, because they have already started retconning stuff from Chronicle 1 and probably Chronicle 2 as well. Anyway, so would I recommend Chronicle 3? If you are a fan of the lore, maybe. I'm not sure it's worth full price though, because basically all of the new events of Chronicle 3 are not really worth a book on their own. Well, and everything that isn't new is just a bit weird, so to say. If you are not a fan of the lore, or you don't know the lore necessarily, would I recommend it? Sure. I mean, it's a synthesis of vanilla World of Warcraft and Burning Crusade and Wrath of the Lich King, which people would not necessarily play through, and of Cataclysm as well. But you already are leveling through the Cataclysm zone, so you already kinda know what's going to happen. As for the Warcraft 3 stuff, I guess that would be good to know, although it's not that relevant to present lore. You really should just get, if you are a new fan, just get Chronicle 1 and 2, and then play the games and read the books, I guess, is my recommendation, I guess I could say. So now let's move on to what are the actual new bits of lore that are discussed in this new Chronicle. First off, like I said, Chronicle 3 started off at the end of Beyond the Dark Portal, basically saying, hey, now Draenor turned into Outland and everything that's happened. The new bits of lore, sort of going in order from that. First off, then is the implication that the Sons of Lothar and their campaign on Draenor basically forced Ner'zhul to act recklessly and accidentally destroy Draenor. If it hadn't been for the Sons of Lothar, Ner'zhul would have opened the portals, but he would have done so in a more, sort of say, calm manner, and it wouldn't have destroyed Draenor because he wouldn't have been under pressure to just open portals quickly, and I guess the Horde of Draenor would have been able to conquer the universe and such and so. There also seems to be some contradiction of the Turalyon and Illyria audio drama. If you remember, after Draenor is destroyed and Turalyon and Illyria escape through a rift, they are contacted by Lothraxion, and then they face that one Eredar assassin. The Eredar assassin is basically cut off completely from the story, and Lothraxion is replaced with Xe'ra, which makes me kind of afraid, also considering the fact that Lothraxion does not appear on the Vindicar when you are playing a Lightforged Draenei. It makes me kind of afraid that they might want to retcon his story. Anyway, next up is the fact that Outland, thanks to Ner'zhul opening so many portals and it sort of breaching the boundary between it and the Twisting Nether, is now one of the most important strategic points in the universe, with portals leading almost everywhere, which is why the Legion sends Magtheridon almost immediately after Outland is destroyed to conquer the world. Magtheridon first conquers Hellfire Citadel, where he enslaves the Fel Orcs, and then he sort of fans out and takes the Black Temple. And the Sons of Lothar, the Alliance expedition, sort of wage a guerrilla campaign against him. The Draenei knew that the Alliance was on Outland, but they didn't help in this campaign against the Legion, because the Legion killed them on sight, and if they realized that so many Junai were still there, they would send a lot more forces to Outland, so they continued remaining hidden for the most part in Zangar Marsh. One interesting thing to note is that while it goes on explaining what the major powers of Outland are, well, basically the Burning Legion, the Alliance Expedition, and the Draenei, Chronicle 3 also mentions that the Arakoa, the Sefek Arakoa, all moved to Auchindoun, where they studied, then began worshipping, then began falling under the sway of the dark powers they found there. Which is interesting, first off, because they say that basically all of the Arakoa traveled to Auchindoun. It does not make another separation between the different factions of Arakoa, which is all the weirder because the Arakoa are not mentioned when Chronicle starts detailing the events of Burning Crusade. And it's also weird because these are all the powers that are mentioned in Outland, and there is absolutely no mention of ogres or of Gru and such. And I don't think there's actually even a single mention of Blade's Edge Mountains in all of Chronicle 3. Anyway, Chronicle then moves on to the story of the Lich King and details how after Kil'jaeden captured him while he was trying to escape Draenor, the 5 Dreadlords Tychondrius, Balnazar, Varimathras, Deathrock, and Mal'Ganis were charged by Kil'jaeden with torturing Ner'zhul. Ner'zhul then eventually, because of the torture, began begging to be killed, and Chronicle describes it in a sort of weird fashion. Kil'jaeden decided to grant his wish in exchange for Ner'zhul agreeing to serve him, and Ner'zhul agrees, so Ner'zhul is killed. Then Kil'jaeden passes his spirit through death, to quote, and revives him as a spectral entity, to quote. Kil'jaeden then grants Ner'zhul the suit of armor and the sword Frostmourne, which were crafted by the Dreadlords, in exchange for, and he sends him to Icecrown and promises him that if Ner'zhul is obedient, he will be granted a body to actually wear said armor and will be granted rulership of Azeroth as its king. But Kil'jaeden never intended to actually fulfill that promise, and Ner'zhul never believed that Kil'jaeden would agree to grant said promise. While Ner'zhul arrived in Icecrown and began testing his powers, the Dreadlords then built Icecrown Citadel around him, which is sort of a retcon in the sense that Icecrown Citadel was supposed to only be built after the events of Frozen Throne, after Arthas becomes the Lich King. But anyway, that's secondary at this point. So Ner'zhul starts practicing his powers, and this is another new piece of lore. The first members of the Scourge were various Wendigo and Ice Trolls. Then these servants of the Scourge found a bunch of Raikou sleeping and killed them in their sleep and raised them as undead. So this was the beginning of Ner'zhul's Scourge. Ner'zhul then found a human settlement in Dragonblight, which he poisoned the humans in their sleep and turned them into undead as well. Which wasn't really a new piece of lore. We already knew that from some of the Scourge's first numbers were the humans of Northrend, what few there were of them. It's also interesting that Chronicle details, and this is one part I like about Chronicle 3, it details the power struggles between the Lich King, Ner'zhul, and the Dreadlords sent by Kil'jaeden to control him. Ner'zhul basically acts the part of being obedient, but he masks his true power and his true intentions from the Dreadlords, and he is constantly listening in on the Dreadlords and finds out that the one thing they fear the most is Kil'jaeden, and subtly manipulates them so by using this particular piece of information, basically saying, hey, if you don't agree with my plan, Kil'jaeden might be mad and we might fail. And he basically manipulates them to eventually agree to take up Arthas as Ner'zhul's champion, although he also manipulates them to make them believe that Arthas becoming the champion of the Lich King was the Dreadlord's idea, when in fact it was Ner'zhul's idea all along. And he also orchestrates Mal'Ganis' death by telling Arthas through Frostmourne to kill him, which we already knew, but it also, Chronicle 3 also talks about how the Dreadlords were furious at the Lich King for allowing this to happen, but Ner'zhul managed to convince them that it was just an accident, Arthas wasn't under his complete control then, and it will not happen again. And Chronicle 3 also mentions that the Dreadlords specifically built the Frostmourne so that it would not be able to claim Dreadlord souls like it does with every other living creature, which is why Mal'Ganis' soul was sent back to the Twisting Nether after it died, instead of being obliterated and or absorbed by Frostmourne. Chronicle then moves on to the disputes between the Alliance after the Second War, and this is another part that I did like, that it portrays how certain events affected the dynamic of the Alliance, and how, for example, Doomhammer escaping from Lordaeron was one of the major points which caused the Alliance to break up, because every other kingdom began accusing Lordaeron of incompetence, and it led to a lot of friction. It also states that Doomhammer, after escaping, also struggled with the withdrawal from Fell Magic that all of the other orcs suffered, which we already more or less knew, and that he often met with the Frostwolf clan, which was also the only clan he met with, because it was the only clan that was still out there that would not kill him on sight, so to say. The next bit of information, which is a bit of a retcon, is that the fact that while Deathwing was infiltrating the Alliance as Lord Davos Prestor, he also had help from Nefarian and Onyxia to do this, which could be inferred from the fact that Onyxia then assumes the identity of Lady Prestor later on, but the original lore was basically, while Deathwing was doing all of that and helping the orcs in Beyond the Dark Portal, he charged, this was the original lore before it was retconned here, he charged Nefarian and Onyxia with taking control of Blackrock Spire from the Blackrock orcs there. But anyway, Deathwing and his children are also portrayed as being responsible for a lot of the bad stuff and a lot of the political intrigue which happens in the Alliance. Basically, they sabotage a lot of the Alliance's efforts to find the orcs and to find Doomhammer, basically because the orcs sow chaos, and chaos is the old gods' deal. That's basically the motivation. And Deathwing also contributed to keeping the Dragonmaw clan hidden in Grim Batol. And then the Chronicle details the events of the novel Day of the Dragon, which we finally find out that, because it's been a long contentious issue in the lore whether Day of the Dragon took place after Beyond the Dark Portal or before. We found out that it took place after Beyond the Dark Portal, although the events are changed somewhat in their nuance. Basically, in the novel, originally Ronan was given a mission by the Kirin Tor to go to the Dragonmaw and basically destroy them. A mission which was, well, manipulated along by Crassus, by Coriostras. And the novel originally also had the Alliance and the Dragonmaw in an open conflict. Basically, the Second War never stopped there, so to say. But in this, in Chronicle 3, the Dragonmaw are content to remain hidden in Grim Batol, and Deathwing tries to keep them hidden there so he can enact his plans to steal Alexstrasza's eggs from Grim Batol. But Crassus sends Ronan there. He informs Ronan that the Dragonmaw is still there, and Ronan then goes. And it's also interesting to note that the original novel had had the mention of the fact that before the events of the novel, Deathwing appeared before the Kirin Tor and sort of faked his own death. Basically, he attacked the mages of the Kirin Tor, and the mages then defeated and sort of killed him. But this event is not mentioned in Chronicle 3, and admittedly, it was a bit of a weird event to begin with. It was there just sort of to increase the surprise factor that, oh, this is Deathwing, oh, this is serious, especially the fact that he apparently escaped from death. One other thing to mention is that after the events of Day of the Dragon, well, after Deathwing was wounded and was forced to disappear, taking Davos Prester with him and stopping his manipulation of the Alliance, Onyxia remained and continued manipulating the Alliance, and she's the reason Stormwind was isolated and did not actually participate in the Third War. And after these events, Nefarian actually goes to Blackrock Spire and actually takes control of the orcs after the events of Day of the Dragon and not before Beyond the Dark Portal as was originally. Although the nuance of how he does take over is a bit different in the sense that in Chronicle 3 it's presented more as a sort of agreement between Nefarian and Rend Blackhand's horde, rather than Nefarian just outright enslaving them. Basically, it's presented as an agreement. If you Blackrock orcs will keep me hidden, I will keep you safe. So, it's also interesting that Chronicle mentions that the return of the Aspect's power during the events of Day of the Dragon sort of traumatized them. I don't think that it's not exactly the right word, but it created a shock and made them incapable of actually sort of protecting the world immediately. Although it also motivated them that now is the time to actually start protecting the world again. One interesting tidbit in Chronicle 3, which is completely new, is the story of Cho'gall after the Second War and up until Cataclysm. Basically, it's meant to more or less replace the story of the comics. Some of the events of the comics are still mentioned and still considered canon, but other stuff such as you-know-who, the son of Medivh and Garona, are not mentioned. But basically, Cho'gall, after the events of the Tomb of Sargeras, took his clan, the Twilight's Hammer clan, and fled to Kalimdor, which is said to have been a very long trip filled with dangers, but they managed to land in Tanaris anyway. Once in Tanaris, they took refuge in some of the caves beneath the desert, only they were looking for the old god that Cho'gall sensed was in Kalimdor, namely Kafun, only to find out that every night more and more of their members kept dying, and eventually we find out that the one responsible for this is Garona. Garona basically followed Cho'gall and was determined to kill him and everyone associated with the Shadow Council off. And Garona sort of continues this game, so to say, of hunting down the Twilight's Hammer, basically causing a lot of casualties and really frustrating Cho'gall and Kafun as well. And Kafun basically tells Cho'gall, kill Garona or I'm going to kill you. So Cho'gall basically sort of reveals himself, basically invites Garona to strike him down. Garona does, and a battle ensues between Garona and Cho'gall, where Cho'gall is heavily wounded, but he does manage to enslave Garona. And we're going to come back to this storyline later on, but suffice it to say, Cho'gall, with Garona enslaved, then travels to the Scarab Wall, where he performs a spell waking Kafun up. He does not break the Scarab Wall or anything, but he does perform a ritual which wakes Kafun up, and then basically decides, I sense another old god up in Northrend, I'm gonna go there. So yeah. Next up, Chronicle continues detailing stuff about the Alliance and the intrigues happening. One interesting sort of retcon is the reason why Jaina decides to study magic in Dalaran. Chronicle also presents her courtship by Arthas, although not in great detail. Basically, it says that Jaina went to study in Dalaran to get away from her father, who was I wouldn't say insane, but deranged after the Second War and the death of his son, and afterwards, while in Dalaran, she developed an interest for magic. Well, previously, she went to Dalaran specifically to learn magic, and the whole deranged part of her father is not really mentioned. One other thing that I did like was that, and this is not a new piece of lore, but it's a confirmation of a really obscure piece of lore that we knew, but not too many people knew, I guess, which is the fact that in his adolescence, I guess in his before the Scourge happened, Arthas was charged with hunting down the Amani after they attacked Kael'thas after the Second War. Basically, Amani hunting parties kept harassing Kael'thas, and Arthas was sent there to hunt them down. And he did do that. Anyway, this Chronicle then moves on to detail the story of Thrall. It does mention, interestingly enough, that Thrall's escape from Durnhold Keep was the tipping point for the Alliance breaking apart. Basically, it was the point where everyone realized, hey, the internment camp system is pointless, we just wasted a lot of money, and everyone else is incompetent, no, you are incompetent, and so on. And all of this is thanks to Onyxia. And the first ones to leave are Kael'thas, and then Gilneas and Stromgarde, while Lordaeron, Stormwind, and Kulturas remain. They don't really collaborate as much, so to say. Then the story continues to elaborate the events of the Third War, the events leading up to the Third War, rather. And one interesting tidbit is that it tells the story of how Medivh was revived. Now, we already knew that Medivh was revived by his mother, Egwene, but it does detail the event, namely, after Medivh was killed in the First War, his spirit was sort of stuck between worlds and he could see everything that was going on. And he saw the Scourge and the Court of the Damned beginning to do their thing, so he started messaging, so to say, his mother in her sleep and asking her to revive him. And his mother eventually does. And it's interesting that Chronicle sort of portrays in a sort of ambiguous manner how powerful or not powerful Medivh actually is once revived. In this particular chapter, Egwene asks him to use his powers as Guardian to fight the Burning Legion and the Scourge, but Medivh refuses, saying that the risk of him being corrupted again is too great and we need to rely on the mortals, not on Guardians. But it raises the question of, did Medivh then keep his powers as the Guardian after being revived? And I'm not entirely certain of that, because while this chapter implies that it is the case, later chapters where Medivh vanishes after the Third War imply that, actually mention that Medivh is only a spectral being or something like that, and his powers also began to fade during the Third War, and he just sort of vanished completely after the defeat of Archimonde. So it's sort of ambiguous and sort of contradictory, and I'm not certain what to make of it. Anyway, the story then continues on with the events of Warcraft 3 and the Scourge of Lordaeron and Medivh warning the human kingdoms and such and so. It's interesting that the Scourge, I think this was actually an older piece of information, but anyway, it's mentioned that the Scourge was initially just the name for the group of undead that Kael'thas controlled in Lordaeron, the initial outbreak of the plague, so to say, but the name eventually came to encompass all of the Lich King's forces. Another interesting thing tying into the whole emitting stuff is that while the events of the campaign, the human campaign of Warcraft 3 are mentioned, the events of Hearthglen that happened in Hearthglen are not mentioned. In fact, Hearthglen is not mentioned at all, and the events and the Blackrock orcs in Lordaeron, which appeared in the human campaign and in the undead campaign, are also not mentioned at all, really. So it raises the question of if they were actually there, since the story seems to flow seamlessly even without their actual presence. But again, one could argue that it's not necessarily a retcon, but rather it's an omission to help maintain the narrative flow. Next up, Chronicle mentions that the Lich King and the Dreadlords manipulated Myrddin and his party of dwarves in Northrend. Basically, they sort of placed random papers and random journals in their camp talking about this ancient blade named Frostmourne and how powerful and awesome it would be and such and so, which was an interesting detail, obviously. Next up, as it continues to detail events in Warcraft 3, well, it's interesting to note that next up it talks about Thrall's journey to Kalimdor. But it's interesting to note that it mentions that that Thrall began his journey only after the outbreak of the Scourge began. So there you go. It's also interesting that Thrall stole the ships he used to travel from South Shore, which I guess is tying everything together. And if you remember that on the Darkspear Islands, where Thrall recruits the Darkspear trolls and meets Sen'jin and Vol'jin and such, there was a colony of Kultirans. Now, Chronicle says that it was not a colony or an expeditionary force, but rather Kulturas was chasing Thrall once they found out that he stole much of the navy from South Shore, and similar to how part of Thrall's navy shipwrecked on the Darkspear Islands, so too did part of Admiral Proudmoore's navy shipwreck on the Darkspear Islands. And it's also nice that it confirms, which is a piece of information that we already knew again, it confirms the fact that after Thrall leaves with the majority of the horde from the Darkspear Islands to continue to Kalimdor, it confirms the fact that Vol'jin stayed behind for a year or so to gather his remaining tribesmen and gather supplies before also moving on to Kalimdor, and it's the reason why Vol'jin missed out on the Third War. Anyway, one other interesting detail is that after Arthas returns from Northrend and kills his father and such, before he kills his father, all of the undead from Lordaeron pulled back, sort of hid and disappeared, to give the image that Arthas did succeed in stopping the Scourge by killing Mal'Ganis, and to make sure that people would come to the capital city and it would be overcrowded so that they would celebrate Arthas' return, and it would be then the perfect moment for Arthas to strike. And it's also interesting to note that after the destruction of Capital City and the death of King Turnus happens, it's interesting that an entire conflict between Arthas and the Scourge and the other nations of the Alliance happens in Lordaeron. In fact, that is the Third War. It's not just the events in Kalimdor or the Scourge invasion of Quel'Thalas and such. The Third War is also this Alliance campaign in Lordaeron, which failed, against the Scourge. The campaign is not mentioned in great detail, but it does say, hey, this is basically the start of the Third War. Around this time, the story sort of jumps completely to Cosmodan, where it mentions that dwarven explorers in Cosmodan, in Uldaman, accidentally woke up the Trogs, and the Trogs sort of followed the dwarves. The dwarves didn't think they were being followed because they traveled overground, while the Trogs followed them underground. The Trogs sort of arrived near Ironforge, but while they were underground, they sensed all of these vibrations and weird mechanical stuff coming from the direction of Nomargon, and it's the reason why they invaded Nomargon. And two things to note here. First off, Chronicle talks a bit about Gilbin Mechatork and his attitude towards the alliance, so to say, in the Third War. Basically, we already knew that Nomargon did not actively participate in the Third War because of its Trog problem, but Chronicle 3 sort of portrays it as Gilbin wanted to help but knew he couldn't, so he only sort of sent technical advice to the Alliance while he kept the gnomes in Nomargon to fight off the Trogs, but he also didn't inform the Alliance of the Trog menace so that they wouldn't divert forces from the campaign in Lordaeron, because he considered that the campaign of Lordaeron was of much more importance to the Alliance. Basically, the Alliance can survive without Nomargon, but not without Lordaeron, something like that. One other thing to note is that Chronicle does not mention at all, and this is something that I really do dislike because I think it is a major event in the lore, and it's weird that it is not mentioned. It does not mention the events of Operation Nomargon or of Zalazane's fall, which is weird, and we know that they are canon because the events of Zalazane's fall are referenced in Battle for Azeroth, but what can you do? Chronicle 3 also mentions that in the irradiation of Nomargon, thanks to Sicko Thermoplug, about 80% of the entire gnome race died in those events. So yeah. Next up, the next piece of new lore is that the invasion of the Burning Legion after Kael'thas opens the portal in Dalaran was... well, not deliberately. It was deliberately small, so to say, in the sense that a stable portal could not be formed, so only Archimonde and Archimond's elite guard were sent, while keeping the Scourge as sort of the main foot soldiers. And the plan was basically, with the Scourge as the main army and this sort of elite demon strike force, they would then travel to Kalimdor, take the World Tree and the Second Well of Eternity, and use that to open a new portal from which to begin the massive invasion of the Burning Legion. The next event is regarding Gilneas and the events of the summoning of the Worgen with Archmage Argol and such and so. It does mention that, really, in a really stupid fashion, I might add, the Greymane wall was assaulted by the Scourge. So Greymane, in his arrogance, decided to send the army of Gilneas to meet the Scourge head-on, and the army was massacred, and the Scourge came very close to overwhelming the Greymane wall, which is the reason why Greymane had to agree to summoning the Worgen, and the Worgen then turned on the Gilnean soldiers that were still on the other side of the wall, and some of those Gilnean soldiers were allowed to come back to Gilneas, which is how the Worgen curse spread in Gilneas. Go figure. It's also kind of annoying, I might add, that Chronicle 3 portrays Sylvanas and her defense of Kael'thas as being the work of a tactical genius fighting against insurmountable odds, and I get that that's the way they want to portray events, but the image that keeps sticking to my mind is Sylvanas' portrayal in the novel Arthas: Rise of the Lich King, where the events of the destruction of Kael'thas are also detailed, and where Sylvanas is portrayed as a tactical genius, but her actions are the actions of a very stupid person. And I really can't get this mismatch out of my head. I've talked about it on another occasion in a different video, but suffice to say, another really weird fact is that Sylvanas basically sacrifices herself and dies in front of Silvermoon instead of in a sort of feint to lead the Scourge off at Windrunner's Spire. So why is her necklace in Windrunner's Spire? Who can say? Anyway, the next bit of lore is that as Dalaran was destroyed and by Archimonde and plundered by the demons, Tichondrius randomly found the Skull of Gul'dan in Dalaran's vaults and took it. And he planned to use the Skull of Gul'dan to well, first off, he empowered it with further film magics, and then he planned to use it to kill Cenarius, and use that to weaken the defenders of Kalimdor and strengthen the Burning Legion invasion of the place. Now, Cenarius was later on killed by the orcs of Grom Hellscream, thanks to Manoroth and the machinations of Tichondrius, so the Skull of Gul'dan was sort of unnecessary from that point of view, but as we do know later on, the Legion then used it to corrupt Felwood, which was a piece of lore we already knew. Next up, and an interesting piece of lore, is that Tyrande was aware of events happening all across the world and of the Legion invasion and of the Scourge invasion, because the Druids kept her praise through the Emerald Dream. And it's stated that the Night Elves knew of pretty much everything that was going on in Azeroth, in all of Azeroth, but they almost always never intervened because they were isolationist and all of that, and because Tyrande was afraid that intervening was a sign of imperialism and would turn her into a new Ajara and such and so. And one thing to mention is that, and one thing that I dislike about Chronicle 3 is another omission, is that it does not talk about how the Night Elves joined the Alliance at all. It just skips from the Third War to Alliance forces, some Night Elf forces were doing this and such and so. There is no actual connection of how they joined the Alliance, which is again upsetting. They could have tied it in with this particular previous tidbit of how the Night Elves were aware of everything going on Azeroth. One other minor retcon is that the Horde and the Alliance, once they arrived in Kalimdor under the leadership of Thrall and Jaina, respectively, took separate paths to Stone Talon and didn't really fight, with the exception of Grom Hellscream and his Warsong clan. They didn't really fight each other until they met at Stone Talon Peak, where Medivh told them to ally with each other, which is obviously a retcon from the events of Warcraft 3, where Thrall basically had to force his way to Stone Talon through an Alliance blockade. But, well, one could argue that was gameplay over superseding actual story, and it's understandable why it would not be canon. It's also interesting how Chronicle portrays the fact that Cenarius' death had huge repercussions for the Third War and for the Druids in the natural world. Namely, Cenarius' death was the reason the Druids did not immediately join the Night Elves to fight the Burning Legion, because they were basically stuck in the dream thanks to Cenarius' death, and that's why Tyrande had to awaken Malfurion, and Malfurion then had to awaken the druids personally. And the druids then, after being awakened, tried to stir the wild gods and the other entities of Kalimdor to help the fight against the Legion, but Cenarius' death was again the reason why they didn't participate, because it had such a huge shockwave in the natural world, so to say. Next little tidbit of lore is admittedly very minor one regarding how Tyrande released Illidan. Namely, it tries to sort of mitigate Tyrande's blame in the events by saying that she didn't just massacre the Watchers to get to Illidan. She first ordered the Watchers to release Illidan, the Watchers refused, and Tyrande, not tolerating defiance in a time of war, then massacred them so she could release Illidan. Make your own judgments there. It's also interesting that Chronicle tries to sort of, in some ways, portray Arthas as being a bit smarter than he's portrayed in Warcraft 3. Namely, the sort of tempting Illidan to take up the Skull of Gul'dan in the Third War is presented as being Arthas' plan, not the Lich King's, even though originally and in the novel Arthas Rise of the Lich King it was presented as being Ner'zhul's plan. Arthas also participates in the invasion of Kalimdor, but he, of his own initiative, subtly sabotages the war effort for the Legion, basically randomly making the undead not listen to the commands of the Legion and sort of creating chaos and disorder in the ranks of the Legion. And Arthas continued to participate in the campaign in Kalimdor, unlike previous lore where he just appeared to tempt Illidan and then vanished. Arthas did participate in the war, up to and including the Battle of Mount Hydro, and really only very narrowly escaped being killed by the Night Elves and the Alliance and the Horde after the defeat of Archimonde. And speaking of which, it's stated that even if Ner'zhul would heal completely, it would not grant the Night Elves immortality again, because the enchantments made by the dragon aspects are gone. So there you go. One other interesting thing is that after Archimonde is defeated, the Lich King openly rebels against the Legion, which surprises the hell out of Kil'jaeden, which was a moment I did like. But it's stated that Kil'jaeden was especially afraid of the Lich King and of the possibility of the Lich King being victorious over Azeroth, because if the Scourge and the Lich King controlled Azeroth, a Burning Legion invasion, according to Kil'jaeden, would be impossible, because it's stated over time that as the Lich King gathers more and more undead under his command, he becomes more and more powerful himself. And the implication is that as if he were to gain complete control over Azeroth, he would be unstoppable. Which is a bit weird, because previous lore portrayed events as being sort of... Specifically, I think it was the novel Thrall Twilight of the Aspects, which said something like, if the Scourge were victorious, the demons would just come to Azeroth and use their magic to take control of the undead, and they would sort of own Azeroth then without any opposition whatsoever. So there you go. Next up, the next piece of new lore is that we finally know why the Naga under Lady Vashj agreed to serve Illidan, which the reason is basically the old gods told them to do that. Basically, after Illidan called them up from the sea, the old gods whispered to the Naga, hey, go listen to him and obey him, because Illidan is an agent of chaos, and chaos suits our purposes, and if he starts becoming dangerous, kill him. Which is interesting, I guess, although it's a bit weird how how the Naga would then continue to be under the influence of the old gods while on Outland, while Illidan was on Outland, interestingly. But that is not explored. This is the only moment where it is explored. It's also interesting that Chronicle talks about how Illidan retrieves the Eye of Sargeras from the Tomb of Sargeras, but Illidan overestimates the power of the Eye. He tries immediately to destroy the Frozen Throne, realizes he can't because the Eye is not that powerful, and decides then to go to Dalaran because Dalaran is a nexus of magical energies, and to use those magical energies to basically destroy the Frozen Throne. It's also interesting that Chronicle states that Illidan could have used the Eye of Sargeras to completely annihilate Tyrande and Malfurion and Maiev when they came chasing after him, but of his own volition he didn't. Next up, Chronicle talks a little bit about Kael'thas and his relationship to the Blood and High Elves. It's also interesting that it states that Kael'thas, out of all the elite of High Elf and Blood Elf society, he was the only one who was receptive to foreign cultures, which was the reason why he later went to Dalaran to study magic there. But it then continues with the events of the Frozen Throne Night Elf campaign. But the event where Tyrande is swept up in a river and Maiev lies to Malfurion that she's dead, and it is later revealed that Maiev lied and Illidan and Malfurion team up, which was one of my favorite moments of the Frozen Throne. The event is not mentioned at all. In fact, the implication is that it did not actually happen, because Illidan flees to Outland not to escape the Burning Legion as it is implied in the Frozen Throne, but to escape the Night Elves, as so Chronicle says. So the events where Illidan helps Malfurion save Tyrande never actually happened. One other thing that I did sort of like about Chronicle, well, actually I liked it mostly because it validated my opinion, so to say. Basically, before Chronicle Volume 3, there was a sort of debate among the fans of the lore on whether the fact that the reason the Lich King was being weakened in the Undead campaign and the Frozen Throne was either because he forced Frostmourne from his body to give it to Arthas, or because of Illidan's attacks in Dalaran using the Eye of Sargeras. And Chronicle confirms that it is because of the Eye of Sargeras that the Lich King was growing weaker and weaker. And I like it because again, it validates my personal viewpoint. So yeah. One other interesting bit is that it does say that Maiev noticed the existence of the Alliance on Outland, but she didn't actually contact them because that was the moment Kael'thas and Lady Vashj attacked and freed Illidan from Maiev. Next up, we learn that the reason the Lich King called Arthas to Northrend was first off because he was dying from Illidan's attack, and only secondly because he knew that the Burning Legion would attack him. He didn't yet know that it would be through Illidan, but there you go. Next up is not a thing we learn exactly, but rather the events of the founding of Durotar are told, and Rexxar's role is greatly diminished, which was kind of annoying. Many of the things that he was supposed to do are given to Thrall instead, and Thrall is sort of portrayed in a more major role throughout Chronicle 3. We also learned that after the founding of Durotar and the death of Admiral Proudmoore, that Kael'thas asked the Alliance for help in attacking the Horde again. The rest of the Alliance refused, so Kael'thas isolated itself and came to hold a big grudge against Jaina, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, this plotline will be explored more in Battle for Azeroth. We also learned a little bit about how Sylvanas came to join the Horde. Namely, we learned that she first sent emissaries to Quel'Thalas but was refused. Then she sent emissaries to the Alliance, which never came back. Not sure why she even bothered. And then the rest of the stuff where she sent emissaries to the Horde and all of that, as we already knew. The next thing we learn is the introduction of Bolvar. It's not necessarily a thing we learn, but Bolvar is introduced into Chronicle 3, well, as the region for Anduin, but he's introduced as, and the legendary paladin Bolvar 4 Dragon came to blah blah blah. And I was really disappointed because, well, why is he legendary? You know what I mean? He's just introduced as the legendary Bolvar 4 Dragon, and that's all she wrote. The story of Vanilla comes next, and we learn that, I'm not sure how I feel about this, but all of the minor stuff that was happening in Vanilla, like kobolds taking over some random elven forest mine, or centaurs stirring up stuff in Desolace and such, that was actually the work of the old gods. And I'm not joking. Well, not necessarily directly the work of the old gods, but rather the old gods began stirring random stuff up, not necessarily with the intent of, oh, these kobolds will now come to serve us, but rather with the intent of just sowing chaos and keeping the peoples of Azeroth on an uneven footing, so to say. But this is when adventurers came in, and adventurers rose up to the occasion and came to defeat all of these threats and such and so. The next thing we learn regarding the Dark Iron Dwarves is kind of interesting, namely the fact that the Bronzebeards and the Wildhammer Dwarves knew that the Dark Iron Dwarves were enslaved by Ragnaros, but they decided not to help them because they considered it to be a punishment for their sins, so to say. And we later learned that Emperor Dagran Forasan, Moira's deceased husband, wanted to free the Dark Iron Dwarves, and Moira sort of took up this task after he died. And Moira's role is heavily expanded upon in Chronicle. Namely, she, after Magni sends Alliance adventurers to clear Blackrock depths and save her, she refuses to go with them, and the storyline that we already knew. But then she starts spreading rumors that Molten Core is a place filled with treasures and such, and that Ragnaros is planning to conquer the world to draw more adventurers in to free the Dark Iron Dwarves. She gets a response from a very unexpected source, namely the Hydraxian Waterlords respond and send adventurers to the Molten Core, which she did not expect, but, well, we're not going to look a gift horse in the mouth, I guess. And one other thing that I forgot to mention is that Chronicle 3 details which dungeons and which raids were cleared by which respective faction. For instance, like I just mentioned, Blackrock Depths was cleared by the Alliance, while, for instance, Moradon, the instance in Desolace, was cleared by the Horde. And my good friend and a fellow lore aficionado, so to say, Necroxis, made the graphic where he basically detailed which faction got which kill, which I'm going to put up on the screen right now. You can also check out Necroxis's video on Chronicle 3 and his channel in the description below. But, well, I also disagree a little bit with what he considers to be the biggest kills, but that's the topic for another time. The point is, I'm going to show which faction cleared which dungeon thanks to Necroxis' graph, and then I'm going to move on with whatever new lore was revealed other than that. Namely, speaking of Moradon, we learned that, remember how in Vanilla WoW there were the two Centaur clans that you could ally with, the player character could ally with, the Magram and the Gelkis? Well, we learned that the Horde allied with the Magram, who didn't really care much for Centaur tradition, and since they were the only clan that didn't care about Centaur tradition, the Horde allied with them and used them to kill the other Centaur. And then the Horde installed the Khan of the Magram as the sort of more or less puppet leader of the Centaur, hoping that he's not gonna stir up further trouble. We know that trouble was indeed stirred later on in Cataclysm, but it's not mentioned in Chronicle 3. This is where the story of the Centaur ends as far as Chronicle is concerned. We also learned that the Horde cleared Dire Maul, which is sort of contradictory with Traveler, the World of Warcraft Traveler series, namely in the fact that Chronicle 3 refers to the ogres which inhabited Dire Maul as, well, the Gorduni ogres, who are led by an ogre named Gordok, rather than the fact that Gordok is more of a title than an actual name. Basically, as you may probably know, anyone who kills old King Gordok is the new King Gordok, while Chronicle 3 implies that there is only one Gordok which the Horde killed, which runs contradictory to both the in-game information and the information as presented in World of Warcraft Traveler. But anyway, the next thing we learn is a retcon, namely the fact that the Dark Iron Dwarves and Ren Blackhand's Horde were actually at a very tenuous peace rather than in open conflict, as was presumed to be in Vanilla. Which is a retcon I don't necessarily like. I thought it added a bit of intrigue to the political landscape of Blackrock Mountain, but there you go, because both were servants of the old gods, they didn't actually fight each other until Moira came to lead the Dark Irons, and then the Ren Blackhand's Horde started fighting them. And Moira then entices adventurers to raid Blackrock Spire and Blackwing Lair, and she indirectly leaks the information to Thrall and the Horde that that Ren Blackhand's Horde was allied to the Black Dragonflight, which is a small retcon in the sense that in game, in Vanilla rather, Thrall only learns of Ren Blackhand's pretense of being war chief once you do the quest there as the Horde, and because Ren Blackhand claims to be war chief and Thrall cannot accept a challenge to his legitimacy, he then sends adventurers to kill Ren Blackhand. While Chronicle portrays it as Thrall already knew of Ren Blackhand and his pretense of being war chief, he had other stuff to do and only intervened once he heard from Moira that the Blackrock Orcs were allied with the Black Dragonflight. So there you go. One other interesting tidbit is, well, we learned that the Horde clears Wailing Caverns in the Barrens, but oddly enough, Narrowlax is not mentioned, and neither is the mission that Narrowlax was on, namely, he went to the Barrens to try to revitalize it and turned it into the jungle that it was in ancient times. But Chronicle 3 presents it rather as being just a group of Cenarian druids who accidentally got trapped in those caverns and the Horde rescued them. There you go. Well, other than the stuff of which faction cleared which dungeon, which you can see on the screen, We do learn regarding the events of the Sunken Temple that the Atalai, the troll worshippers of Hakkar, and the Emerald Nightmare are not really related. Previously there were all sorts of speculations due to the fact that Sunken Temple was inhabited both by these trolls and by green dragons corrupted by the Nightmare, and the quests were deliberately ambiguous as to the specific relationship between the two forces, but Chronicle 3 just implies that no, the Nightmare came to afflict the green dragons and then the trolls just took advantage of their condition to move in and do their own thing. So there you go. One other interesting thing to note is that Cthulhu ordered Cho'gall to start recruiting for the Twilight's Hammer only after Cho'gall awoke Cthulhu. Previously, Cho'gall only was joined by his previous orc cultists, and only afterwards did he start recruiting various humans. And it's interesting that it portrays the recruitment of Archbishop Benedictus, who was recruited at some point between early vanilla and Cataclysm, more towards on the early vanilla side. And one weird sort of retcon about him rather, is the fact that it is mentioned that after Cho'gall dies in Cataclysm, Benedictus openly assumes the role of leader of the Twilight's Hammer, as opposed of him continuing to pretend to be the Archbishop of the Holy Light that he claimed to be. Chronicle 3 basically states that he abandoned the persona of the bishop to become the Twilight Father. Right? Next up, the next thing that we learn is during the Second War of the Shifting Sands, namely the adventurers led by Saurfang against Ahn'Qiraj, we learned that it was Saurfang who ordered that the gates be opened and the scepter of the Shifting Sands be used, and he ordered that it be reforged. So there you go. Next up, the novel. I'm only presenting new pieces of lore. I'm skimming over a lot of other stuff. The novel presents the events of the War of the Ancients trilogy, the books, where Ronin and Crassus and the orc Broxgar travel back in time to the War of the Ancients, and states that, which is something you probably expected already, the fact that Broxgar, when he jumped through the portal and wounded Sargeras, that all of this happened on Argus, which makes sense. It's not really a surprise, but I guess it's nice to know, to get confirmation for this. And we also learned that after the events of the novel, Nozdormu then disappeared into the Timeways to find out who was messing with them. Next up we learn why Lady Vashj was sent to Zangarmarsh to drain all of the water of Outland and such. Previously there were various theories, there were various implications. The Illidan novel said one thing, the quest in Outland said another and such. But now we learn the reason is that Illidan was gathering an army to fight the Burning Legion, and Lady Vashj was to gather all of the water of Outland to use as drinking water for said army, not caring about the ecological consequences of what she was doing. The next thing we learn is a retcon, namely the fact that Chronicle 3 states that Illidan only begun training demon hunters after he firmly instated himself as Lord of Outland, which is a bit of a retcon because we already knew of some demon hunters which existed before all of these events, even before Illidan was released from prison. But Chronicle states that no, this is when demon hunters really started, and this is when Illidan gave them the name of demon hunters. And we also learn, which we kind of already knew, that Illidan kept these demon hunters a secret from everyone, even from Kael'thas and from Lady Vashj. So yeah. Speaking of Kael'thas, we finally learn the reason why he was turned evil. It's not a very good reason, and perhaps it would have been better if it was detailed more, but basically, Kael'thas continues to struggle with his magic addiction. He and his people cannot find a source of magic to satisfy their needs on Outland, so he asks Illidan to teach him how to drain fel energies, which Illidan does, and Kael'thas grows addicted to these fel energies. Then Kil'jaeden starts slowly tempting Kael'thas. It's stated that this temptation on Kil'jaeden's part took a long time, specifically because of the fact that Kael'thas knew that Kil'jaeden was responsible for the corruption of the Sunwell and the Legion invasion and such and so he was naturally a bit hesitant about that. But Kil'jaeden keeps whispering in his ear, and the final moment where Kael'thas decides to sever his ties with Illidan is when Voronthal the Seer, the leader of the Scryers, betrays Kael'thas, and we also learn that Illidan did send the Scryers to attack Shatraf City. It wasn't a manipulation by the Legion, it was actually Illidan's fault. Go figure. Anyway, so Kael'thas learns of this betrayal. He asks Illidan to do something about it, and Illidan says, "I'm too busy planning the campaign against the Legion, never mind them," which Kael'thas takes as the final breaking point, and then he he says, "I'm going to Netherstorm." Illidan does not immediately suspect that Kael'thas is deserting him, but there you go. And the final step in Kael'thas fully becoming obedient to the Legion is the fact that he was defeated in Tempest Keep by the Horde, which included his own people, the Blood Elves, which was the final breaking point for the character. And despite the fact that it's obviously not presented in perhaps the depths it should be presented, I did like the fact that they finally explained why Kael'thas went evil, and they also added an interesting character point for him, which I did like, namely the fact that he really wanted to return to Quel'Thalas as a victor, bringing back home the cure for the Blood Elves' addiction, because he was extremely unpopular in Quel'Thalas. And it also raises an interesting possibility regarding the political system of the Blood Elves, I guess. Namely, well, as we all know, Silvermoon is littered with statues of Kael'thas, which the Blood Elves have not yet taken down, even though it's been however many years since his betrayal. But we also learn here that Kael'thas was incredibly unpopular with his people. So these statues are basically just propaganda instituted by the leadership of Silvermoon to instill loyalty to Kael'thas. And Chronicle does later state that Lor'themar did not entirely keep Kael'thas in the loop on everything that was going on in Silvermoon, especially on Anvina, basically the fact that the Sunrose energies were preserved in Anvina, because of the fact that Lor'themar feared that Kael'thas was too impulsive and would do something rash, such as, for example, using Anvina to try to prematurely reignite the Sunwell, which might result in the Sunwell being permanently destroyed or something like that. Anyway, it later details, Chronicle later details how Kil'jaeden realizes that Illidan is trying to destroy the Legion, and he comes to fear that Illidan might very well succeed. So he sends High Lord Cruel to conquer Outland, and he funnels a lot of resources into the conquest of Outland. And High Lord Cruel does have a very hard time in establishing a foothold and waging his campaign, but he does eventually manage to slowly establish a foothold and fight Illidan. But Kil'jaeden is worried that this campaign is not progressing quickly enough, So he decides that he's going to lure Azeroth to Outland, the heroes of Azeroth to Outland, so they can take out Illidan for him. And he does this basically because of the fact that news from Outland via the Draenei informed the societies there that Outland was ruled by this evil despot Illidan, who consorted with demonic powers and such, and Kil'jaeden, by opening the portal, sort of made the nations of Azeroth think that this Illidan was an immediate threat, which is why they went and decided to go and kill him. And it's also mentioned that the demon survivors of the Third War slowly infiltrated Azerothian societies, and they discovered the fate of the Sunwell and the fact that its power now resided in the girl Anvina, which is how Kael'thas then came to know of her, and how he knew how to attack Silvermoon and take her in order to start his project of reviving the Sunwell and using its energies to bring Kil'jaeden into Azeroth. We also, an interesting little, I suppose you could call it retcon, is the fact that previously the Naaru came to Outland and to Shattrath City because of Khadgar sort of probing the Great Dark Beyond and coming into contact with the Naaru. But here it's stated that Velen's prayers also called the Naaru's attention to Outland, and it's also the reason why they came. The Naaru then came via Tempest Keep. There were 3 Naaru in Tempest Keep: Adal, which later came to lead Shattrath City; Muru, which was used to reignite the Sunwell; and Oros, which came to reside in the Exodar. And Adal then chose Shattrath City because he sensed the Aldor priests there. This is already an old piece of information, but a new piece of information is the fact that the Sons of Lothar, alongside the Draenei, then rebuilt Shattrath City. Later on, we learn that as Kael'thas conquered Tempest Keep, Oros defended the Exodar and barred the Blood Elves' access from the facility, which was how Velen and his Draenei managed to take it over. And we also learned that Kil'jaeden was aware of Velen's plan to take over the Exodar, and Kil'jaeden was already allied with Kael'thas, but he allowed Velen to steal the Exodar without telling Kael'thas that this was his plan, in order for Velen to reach Azeroth and for him to spread rumors about how much of a threat Illidan actually was, in order to mobilize the peoples of Azeroth against him. So there you go. One interesting little tidbit is also the fact that once Kael'thas and his Blood Elves settled in Tempest Keep, they dismantled most of it and used its parts to construct the mana forges of Netherstorm, and that is the reason why Tempest Keep cannot travel the stars anymore, and why Tempest Keep was not involved, say, in the campaign on Argus, because most of its systems were dismantled. We also learned that Kael'thas planned to use the mana forges to make mana cells, which are basically batteries for mana, so to say, and send them to, and Kil'jaeden actually urged him to send them to Quel'Thalas, presumably Kael'thas to presume to help his people, but actually Kil'jaeden sent them so that he could use them to aid in his invasion of Azeroth and use them to reignite the Sunwell and usher in his entry into Azeroth. The next thing we learn is that the Ethereals, well, this is a minor piece of lore, the Ethereals, before the whole destruction of Koresh happened and such, they were called Koreshi before they became ethereal people, so to say. So the actual name of the species is Koreshi. There you go. We also learned that Illidan's attack on Nafreza, which was detailed in the Illidan novel, and the fact that he sort of imploded the portal, causing Nafreza to be destroyed. That event killed every single demon on Nafreza, absolutely no survivors. And this was the tactic Illidan planned to use in his fight against the Legion. Basically, infiltrate their worlds using a big portal and then implode that portal, so the implosion would then cause the destruction of the world, as it happened with Ner'zhul's portals in Outland and as it happened with the portal to Nafreza. Which I guess could have worked, maybe. Anyway, the reason why Velen came to take the Exodar is the fact that Adol, the Naru Adol, sensed that demons continued to gather in Outland, and so he tried to recruit a sort of volunteers to go to Azeroth and try to get the aid of Azeroth in this endeavor. It's also interesting, another thing that we learn, which is kind of weird, is the fact that Kael'thas' decision to ally with Lady Vashj and with Illidan back in the Frozen Throne permanently soured relations between Quel'Thalas and the Alliance. It sort of makes sense in the fact that the only important Alliance person to report on those events was Garithos, who obviously would have given the events a much more negative spiel, but it also feels a little weird. And then Sylvanas intervened for the Blood Oaths so that the Horde would accept them. And there are two weird things regarding this. Firstly, we find out because of Chronicle 3 that initially Sylvanas wanted to ally with Quel'Thalas and the Blood Oaths, but they refused her, so it's all the more weirder that she would intervene on their behalf. Chronicle states that many have speculated on the reasons why Sylvanas has done this, but no, there isn't necessarily a clear reason as of yet. And the second thing is that the second weird thing is that Chronicle 3 portrays the alliance between the Blood Oaths and the Horde in a much more benign light, I guess you could say. Namely, it says that the Horde and the Blood Oaths realized that this alliance could only be of mutual benefit, and so the Horde and the Blood Oaths immediately accepted to become allies. Whereas in-game, in Eversong Woods and the Ghostlands, in those starting zones, we learn that the Blood Oaths have a hell of a hard time enjoying the Horde because their kingdom lies in ruins and they don't even control all of it, and the Horde only really accepts the Blood Oaths after they kill Darkhan Drafir, and even then only just. Fro even crumples Lor'thromar's letter in front of the Blood Oath emissary that he sent, and his words of congratulating the Blood Oaths for joining the Horde is not entirely very warm, so to say. Welcome to the Horde, elf. So there you have it. Another contradiction between Chronicle 3 and the events of in-game. Anyway, one interesting tidbit, I guess, is one of the reasons why Thrall came to choose Garrosh as his advisor was the fact that Garrosh was especially versed in Orcish culture, which is weird to me, namely because in all of the previous instances of Garrosh, namely in Tides of War specifically, Christy Golan, now at the time she wasn't a bigwig story person at Blizzard, she was just the author of the novel, but she sort of said that her image of Garrosh is of someone who has always wanted to be in touch with Orcish traditions, but has never actually connected with those traditions because he has never had the opportunity to learn them because of the whole blood curse and such and so. which is a small contradiction between Christie Golden's old opinion from a few years ago and Chronicle 3, which, take it as you may, Christie Golden's words were obviously not exactly canon, but they were a valid impression of perhaps the view of Blizzard at the time. Who knows? Anyway, we later learned that Zul'jin attacked the Blood Elves in patch 2.3 because most of their armies were away in Outland dealing with Kael'thas and everything that happened there, and Zul'jin also feared that the Blood Elves alliance with the Horde would mean that the Blood Elves and the Horde would eventually attack him, so it was sort of a preemptive strike, so to say. Now, one thing that I did dislike about Chronicle's changes to the lore is that they change sort of the events of Sunwell Plateau. And I'm not talking necessarily about the fact that the Horde kills Kael'thas and the Alliance kills Kil'jaeden, but rather the fact that Muru's role in the story is greatly diminished. Now, in Burning Crusade, Muru was presented as a Naru who chose to sacrifice himself for the sake of the Blood Elves. He allowed himself to be captured by Kael'thas. He allowed the Blood Elves to feed on him. He allowed himself to be corrupted at the Sunwell so that he could then restore the Sunwell and cure the Blood Elves and provide them a connection to the light. That was the original story in Burning Crusade, and it was again presented as a big sacrifice. While Chronicle 3 just says that Muru was just another victim of Kael'thas, and the only reason Muru's energies came to revitalize the Sunwell is the fact that Velon happened to be nearby. Velon noticed that Muru still had some light energies, and he decided that, hey, let's not let it go to waste, I guess, and the Sunwell was revitalized with the energies of the light. And one other retcon is the fact that Lady Liadrin only started wielding the light, being an actual paladin, willingly and not forcing the light through Muru, after the Sunwell was restored and not immediately after Kael'thas' betrayal. Previously in Burning Crusade, after Kael'thas' betrayal, she travels to Shatrath City and offers her profound apologies to Adal and vows to restore, to defeat Kael'thas and such, and she becomes a paladin then. But Chronicle says that no, she became a paladin only after the Sunwell was restored. So there you go. The next thing we learn is regarding the Twilight's Hammer storyline. As I mentioned, Cho'gall then traveled to Northrend, to Yogg-Saron's prison, where he hoped to destroy his prison as he did with C'Thun. But Yogg-Saron's prison was much stronger, so Cho'gall only managed to weaken it. And one interesting thing that I did like is the fact that Yogg-Saron's influence over the keepers of Ulduar before Cho'gall's intervention was mentioned as being only a very tenuous control. Yogg-Saron couldn't force the keepers to actually do his bidding. He could only influence them. And Cho'gall had to sneak into Ulduar, otherwise the keepers would have killed him. But Cho'gall, the fact that he managed to weaken Yogg's prison, even though he didn't manage to completely destroy it, managed to boost Yogg-Saron's power, and Yogg then managed to utterly control the other keepers. And this is when, after these events, Yogg learned of C'Thun's defeat at Ahn'Qiraj and ordered Loken to create the Iron Army, the Iron Dwarves, the Iron Vraiku, and the Iron Giants, to serve as his protection so that the adventures of Azeroth aren't going to do with him what they did to C'Thun. And an interesting thing to note is that as Chronicle details the events of Wrath of the Lich King, Yogg-Saron takes great steps to remain hidden in Northrend rather than exert his influence as it happened in Wrath of the Lich King. In Wrath of the Lich King, as early as Howling Fjord, there were signs of Yogg-Saron's influence and presence and corruption, while Chronicle 3 implies that he tried to keep himself hidden and only kept his forces in the Storm Peaks and in Ulduar so that the adventurers wouldn't come and kill him. And C'Thun's defeat, not death, Chronicle 3 takes great steps to mention that C'Thun was only defeated. C'Thun's defeat convinces Cho'gall that the best way to make sure that the Old Gods succeed is to drive a wedge between the Horde and the Alliance so that he can give Yogg-Saron time to actually gather his powers. And it's also interesting that Chronicle, which is something we already knew, but Chronicle 3 basically states that other than the skirmishes in Warsong Gulch and the Rough Basin and such, the Horde and the Alliance had slowly been growing closer and closer in their relations as Vanilla World of Warcraft and Burning Crusade progressed. And a summit on Faramore was supposed to happen, the summit in the comics, and this is when Garona intervenes, as it happened in the comics, under the orders of Cho'gall, and she ruins the relations between the Horde and the Alliance and such. Garona is later captured, and one interesting new tidbit of the lore is that Jaina and Egwene aren't able to completely break the Twilight's Hammer control over her, but she still spills information on Cho'gall and eventually leaves to fight Cho'gall and track Cho'gall in the Twilight Highlands. And the one thing that I did dislike is that the events of Cycle of Hatred, which happened between Warcraft 3 and World of Warcraft, are not mentioned at all in Chronicle 3, and Egwene is presented as, oh, she just sort of randomly came to Faramore and Jaina convinced her to settle there. So the events of Cycle of Hatred, perhaps more so than any other novel, so to say, are more or less retconned, which I think is unfortunate. Now, Cycle of Hatred isn't the greatest novel, but I thought it was interesting enough. The next thing we learn is regarding the Nexus War, namely the fact that as Malygos regained his sanity and noticed the state of magic in the world and such, and he did all of his things, the Kirin Tor sent mages to investigate. And something which is kind of funny in an absurd way, the mages came to investigate, they noticed what was happening, Malygos then showed up in front of them, and he explained in very great detail why he was doing what he was doing, why Azeroth is doomed if he doesn't do what he does, and why they should then help him. And most of the mages agreed to join him, some didn't, and Malygos then killed, and the events of the Nexus War then play out. Though it's interesting that in previous lore there was the implication that Malygos met with the other dragons to share his concerns. The other dragons, when Malygos said we have to kill all the mages of the world, the other dragons said, well, let's stop and think about it, while Malygos would have said, you are all not thinking big enough, I have to do this. This supposed meeting is not mentioned at all, and I suppose one could say was retconned. The next thing we learn is regarding the inner conflict between Arthas and Ner'zhul regarding for the consciousness of the Lich King, so to say. Chronicle 3 mentions a weird sort of motivation for Arthas, namely, Arthas in his corrupted state believed that only through imposing order on Azeroth via the Scourge could he protect it from all of the threats going on, such as the Old Gods and the Legion and such. And the way he defeats Ner'zhul differs from the novel Arthas Rise of the Lich King, in that Arthas preys on Ner'zhul's one remaining weakness, which I found to be interesting, namely the fact that Ner'zhul still felt guilty for what he did to doom his people, the orcs. So Arthas preys on this, he makes Ner'zhul go insane, he rips Ner'zhul's consciousness apart until, and I quote, "Nothing remained of Ner'zhul but a wail of sorrow in the back of the Lich King's consciousness. Arthas found it easy to ignore." Which isn't exactly the same as saying that Ner'zhul is permanently dead, but again, on the other hand, it's hard to see how he could ever become another threat again, so to say. One thing that I forgot to mention is the fact that Chronicle 3 mentions that the dragon aspects were not made aware that Azeroth contains a world soul, and this is one of the main reasons why Malygos' campaign to send all of the magic on Azeroth to the Twisting Nether was so dangerous, namely the fact that, first off, magic is the Titans and the World Souls thing, and second off, the fact that sending all of that magic into the Twisting Nether would create a bunch of natural disasters on Azeroth, which would heavily wound the world. So, a sort of retroactive justifying of our actions, I suppose. Neither Malygos nor Alexstrasza nor the adventurers knew that Azeroth was a world soul at the time, so it's more of a retroactive continuity sort of thing, not in the sense of actually retconning something. What's also interesting is that the Scourge's attacks on Kael'thas and Eastern Kingdoms just before Wrath of the Lich King, including the attack on Orgrimmar and on Stormwind, they were just feints designed to sort of provoke the two factions to launch an assault on Northrend and send their greatest champions so the Lich King could raise them, yada yada. We already knew the Lich King's plan. But it does mention that the Lich King did intend to utterly annihilate the Scarlet Crusade and the Argent Dawn. So that campaign, namely the one in the Death Knight starting zone, was completely serious, no questions asked. The next thing that we learn, which is admittedly a very minor thing, is the fact that the Warsong offensive, the Horde offensive in Northrend, is named after is just named after the clan and is not composed of the clan, as we most of us in the lore community sort of came to the conclusion that, oh, the Warsong offensive, it means that it must be composed mostly of the Warsong clan. No, it's just a name it picked off of the clan. One thing that I did really dislike on Chronicle 3 is that it shows how each of the factions advanced in Northrend, namely, it shows that the Horde came through Borean Tundra, and only through Borean Tundra, and the Alliance came through Howling Fjord, and only through Howling Fjord, which basically eliminates all of the big storylines that happened for the Horde and the Alliance in the other respective zones. We don't get, for instance, Fasarian's storyline in Borean Tundra, or the Forsaken storyline in Howling Fjord and Dragonblight. We don't get that, which is unfortunate, and I hope it's not a hard retcon, so to say. I don't know how I could actually say it. Anyway, we later learned that the armies of the Horde and the Alliance were advancing a bit too fast on Iceground, so the Lich King sent Kel'Thuzad to sort of stall them, but Kel'Thuzad brought Naxxramas too close to the front lines, and he miscalculated the danger of the Alliance and Horde, and the Alliance and Horde then killed him. There you go. It's also interesting that Chronicle 3 addresses somewhat the rumors of what may have happened to Kel'Thuzad. Pretty much everyone in the lore community, because we did not destroy Kel'Thuzad's phylactery, presume that Kel'Thuzad is still alive. While Chronicle 3 states that Rumors quickly spread that his soul was lost to the Shadowlands, the realm of the dead, which I guess is a way of saying that, yeah, Kael'thas is permanently gone, we just sort of forgot to include his phylactery there, although the wording is ambiguous enough to warrant an eventual return of Kael'thas. The next thing we learn is a really minor thing, the fact that the events of Night of the Dragon, the book, happened simultaneously with the Nexus War. Previously, it was known that Night of the Dragon happened just before Wrath of the Lich King, rather than at the same time as it. We also learned that the Kirin sort of assumed the task of rebuilding Azeroth's ley lines and its magical properties after the Nexus War, and they did eventually succeed in restoring them to their former power. We also learn that the events of the at the Wrathgate are detailed. We learned that 5,000 Alliance soldiers and 4,000 Horde soldiers were at the Wrathgate. The telling in Chronicle also retcons the idea that the Lich King can only be killed at the Frozen Throne, which was the main motivation behind Uther's speech in Halls of Reflection. Oh, you can only defeat them at the Frozen Throne and such. No, Chronicle says that if the Forsaken had not intervened at the Wrathgate, the Lich King probably would have died there. It's also interesting that later on, as the events of the Battle of the Undercity happen, Sylvanas implies to the leaders of the Horde and the Alliance that she had no idea of the new plague and it was only Varimalthus and Putris' plan. But Chronicle 3 quickly states that she lies, she knew of the plague, she ordered its production, and she might have even known and approved of the Wrathgate. It's not stated that it's the truth, but it's stated as a definite possibility that she knew and approved of the events of the Wrathgate. There we go. It's also later on mentioned that with the fight with Algalon the Observer after we defeat Yogg-Saron, that Algalon and neither Algalon nor the adventurers knew that the Titans were actually dead or defeated, I guess you could say. And it says that though the Titans would never actually receive Algalon's signal, Algalon's signal would still have activated the Forge of Origination in Oldham, and all life on Azeroth would have indeed been purged. So yeah. The next thing that Chronicle states is a minor point, namely the fact that as Saurfang remained in Northrend to oversee the faction's withdrawal from the continent as such, his absence is the main reason why everything went wrong for the Horde, which is what Chronicle implies, because the Horde could not benefit from his experience and leadership. So there you go. The next thing that is interesting, and although it's a minor point, is that it details a little how Bolvar came, the shock that Bolvar experienced once he came into control of the undead, how he was separated from the light, and how his control of the undead warred with his personal values of justice and righteousness, and because of this he could only establish control over most of the undead, but the undead in the Plague Lands, such as those under the Code of the Damned, eluded his control. And we also learn that the events of Edge of Night, where Sylvanas kills herself atop Icecrown Citadel and the Valkyr join her, is a reason why once Bolvar found out that, hey, the Valkyr are no longer responding to me, I need not just to safeguard the living from the Scourge, I need to keep the living from misusing the Scourge's power, so I need to hoard and keep all of the power of the Scourge for myself, which is interesting, I guess. The next thing that Chronicle talks about is a sort of Deathwing's relationship with N'Zoth as a sort of prelude to the Cataclysm. It basically confirms that every single event in Cataclysm, almost without exception, was N'Zoth's fault. Every single thing was his manipulation. It also states that the reason Deathwing, Deathwing was defeated during the events of the Day of the Dragon, after which he took refuge in Deepholm, which we already knew. But while in Deepholm, N'Zoth further empowered Deathwing, so much so that this power that Deathwing was consuming, along with Deathwing consuming and taking the power of the elemental plane, made Deathwing incredibly unstable, which is the reason why Deathwing had to replace his adamantium plates with elementium plates, which the Twilight's Hammer Kael'thas put on him. It's also stated that the fact that Deathwing was gathering all of this energy from the elemental planes is the reason why the elements were so distressed and in chaos in the events which came before Cataclysm, which makes sense and it's a good addition to the story, I suppose. It also states, which is a bit I kind of did dislike, I guess, the reason for why the Horde and the Alliance conflict starts anew in Cataclysm is the fact that Garrosh sends forces to Ashenvale to take over the resources there, and this event is the reason why Cairn grows enraged and duels Garrosh and dies and such. But it also means that it retcons the Twilight's Hammer attack on the Druids, which convened in Ashenvale, which was the reason why Cairn challenged Garrosh, and the previous reason why the Horde and Alliance went to war, because the Horde and Alliance presumed that Garrosh ordered this attack on the Druids, when it was in fact the fault of the Twilight's Hammer. But actually, Chronicle 3 states that no, Garrosh did send forces into Ashenvale, which sparked all of these events. Which I kind of dislike. It feels kind of like, well, I've already talked in previous videos how they seemed unsure of whether to turn Garrosh into a good character or an evil character, so it seems to me like they're retroactively changing events which painted Garrosh in a more positive light to paint him in a more negative or warmongering light, so to say. It also Chronicle also mentions that the elemental unrest caused many of the Dark Irons to revert to worshipping Ragnaros again, and it led to a split in Dark Iron society, and many of those who swore to worship Ragnaros again then led a rebellion against Moira, and this is the reason why Moira then went to Ironforge, because it was the only place where she could keep her kind safe, and she also had the right to rule Ironforge by virtue of blood. We also later learned that the reason Deathwing was in Stormwind and that big logging screen and cinematic thing wasn't out of sheer randomness, but rather he intentionally went to Stormwind so he could scare the population, so that Benedictus would have an easier time converting them, which is a good and interesting plan, I guess. We also later learned that the reason why Gallywix managed to stay in control of the Bilgewater cartel is that no other goblin had his connections and his charisma, and he was also responsible, and credit where credit is due, for turning Azshara into a new home for the goblins and building Bilgewater Harbor. Interestingly enough, Thrall's involvement in the storyline in the Goblin Starting Zone is skipped entirely. And speaking of things skipped entirely, Mayev's part in the novel Wolfheart is also skipped entirely, which I guess is a bit unfortunate, although it was always a bit of a weird bit of characterization, and it was always clear that Blizzard didn't really have any idea what to do with it. And though it continues to have a really ambiguous state in canon. Anyway, it's also mentioned that N'Zoth's strategy for Cataclysm was launch all of these attacks: Deepholm, Vajir, Mount Hyjal, Oldham, and the Twilight Highlands, because he felt that N'Zoth considered that even if just one of these attacks would succeed, then the Hour of Twilight would be ushered in. And he felt that the Horde and the Alliance couldn't possibly manage to respond and tackle all of them. Though N'Zoth did not fully count on the intervention of the Irvin Ring and the Cenarian Circle and other neutral factions like that. The next thing we learn is that it's also a minor thing. It's mentioned that among the defenders of Hyjal, other than the Druids and Adventurers, the Knight of Military also defended Hyjal against the forces of Ragnaros, which is cool, I guess. It makes sense story-wise. It makes sense why it would not be in-game, because it would create a bit of a faction imbalance, but it makes sense why it would be happening in the story. It also states that the Horde wages a separate campaign from the Alliance in Twilight Highlands, which we already knew, but Garona only helps the Horde, and the Horde clears the Bastion of Twilight, although Garona does not exactly take part in the defeat of Cho'gall. It's also mentioned that Alexstrasza being defeated by Deathwing in the Twilight Highlands is the reason she flees to Wyrmrest Temple, and the reason why the whole Twilight of the Aspects novel happens. Although there are a few retcons, namely the first one is a minor retcon, the fact that the Twilight's Hammer infiltrators beneath Wyrmrest Temple, who are corrupting the eggs of the various dragonflights. Chronicle 3 states that they plan to turn those eggs into Twilight Dragons, while the original novel had them turned into Chromatic Dragons, which is a minor retcon, but one I admittedly dislike because I think Chromatic Dragons are way cooler than Twilight Dragons, but that's just me. One other thing that I did dislike is that Chromatus, the big Chromatic Dragon, the last experiment of Nefarian and such, is not mentioned at all, and the events of the Twilight of the Aspects happen without him, which is pretty weird because, well, the Wyrmrest Accord is shattered and the dragons flee Wyrmrest Temple, and the Twilight's Hammer occupies it just because they would want to have a base from which to resurrect Chromatus, which was rather unfortunate, I guess. Another weird thing is in the events of the dungeons of patch 4.3, namely End Time, Well of Eternity and such, it's stated that the Horde clears End Time, but the motivation for that is a bit weird, namely it's presented as if the Horde's ferocity and dedication was what inspired Nozdormu to finally face his future self in End Time, which is a weird way of putting it, I guess. Another thing that was mentioned is, this is the last new piece of lore, is that at the end of the Dragon Soul raid, Deathwing was infused with a lot more power by N'Zoth, because N'Zoth felt that his final chance was slipping away, and this is why Deathwing breaks apart and is capable of starting an entire new cataclysm in at the end of the raid, if the adventurers had not stopped him, which is interesting enough, I guess. Like I said, the interactions between Deathwing and N'Zoth are some of the more interesting aspects of the Chronicle 3. So yeah, these are all of the events of the new lore. It's interesting that Chronicle ends with a to be continued, which I could refer to the story being continued in the game, could refer to a future Chronicle being written, perhaps after more expansions of World of Warcraft have passed. But all in all, as a sort of conclusion, other than what I have already said in this video, Chronicle 3 only really shows as sort of new information, different perspectives on events, which again I'm not sure if they warrant an entire book, at least again not necessarily full price. So yeah, I guess this is all I have to say about Chronicle. I mostly gave my general thoughts in the introduction. Apologies for the delay in this video again, and yeah, I will see all of you later, and farewell.